Hello, everybody. Today is day 140. We're reading from Psalms 5, 38, 41, and 42. What is it that draws a person closer to God? Have you ever considered that, contemplated what it is that stirs your heart or that you observed in other people? What would your answer be to that? Now, some people might say, well, it's, when you experience the goodness of God and the blessing of God and provision and family and everything's going well in your life, but it might surprise you that in actuality, when we read the book of Psalms, we find that it was the difficulties of life that actually impacted David in his walk with God. David is a man that somehow is driven with a deep desperation for God. This comes out with great frequency, even though he identifies a lot of the challenging aspects of life. The fact is, he keeps reverting back to God, praising God. In fact, he says, as the deer pants for the water, so pants my soul for you, O God. My soul thirsts for God. It might surprise you what was the secret for David's passionate walk with God. In fact, I would suggest there are two basic things I find in reading these Psalms. First one is the inner grief of previous hidden sin, that sin had caused so much havoc in his life that his misery that he identifies and his troubled mind, and he speaks of inflammation even in his body and the turmoil in his heart. Now, for some people, this could cause depression and discouragement and absolute desire to end life. But he says, I declare my iniquity. I'm in anguish over my sin. And sin reminds us of our desperate need for God's forgiveness. And I think this is what David is identifying. He looks at the repercussions of sin, the consequences of sin, and how it had mounted up in his life. And he says, without God, we are wretched. We are lost. We're doomed. And David had plenty of sins. He'd been reminded of continuously of the repercussions of bad decisions he'd made in his life, and he knew he deserved God's wrath and the justice of God, and that's why he speaks about the fear of God. He's reminded that it's what God could do and what God deserved to do in his life. The second thing that brought David to close intimacy with God is broken relationships. Now, this also conflicts with what we would think, but there was the family breakdown and the children and Absalom that wanted to kill him and take his kingdom, and just the moral collapse that he had within inside, and this not only family breakdown but friends who had turned on him, those who he had such confidence and trust in. He said, even my own familiar friend whom I trusted, who ate my bread, has lifted up his heel against me. You can almost feel the pain and the hurt that he's experienced in his life. He says, my loved ones and my friends stand afar off. My relatives stand away from me. So this drove David to God as a personal companion. It's who became his good friend, his close friend. And that's why we see him speaking to God in such intimacy. His kingdom had been challenged again and again. But he dared to trust God, even those around him had forsaken. It appears that David became a God addict. That is, there was nothing else that satisfied him. And he got an appetite, even like what we would call a drug addict, but his addiction was to God. And you see it in his meditation night and day. You see it in his going to God's house because he craved the presence of God. You see it in his worship and his prayer. Even as it says again and again, we hear him saying early in the morning, late at night, on my bed. Then we see this intense hunger and thirst for more of God. He couldn't arrive. He couldn't get there. Like Moses, we see this rising up. Why are you cast down, O my soul? He asks himself. He's looking inside and he's saying, why? I mean, yeah, all of these things are bad and ugly, but why are you allowing these things to drive you? And then he commands his soul. It's his hope in God. And yet, in spite of all this, I will praise him. And then he says this one statement: deep calls unto deep. I love that, because somehow there's something that just cannot satisfy. There's something that is burning on the inside of our hearts, like what did with David. And so he talks about deep calls unto deep, that there is this raging obsession that he could not pacify. It's this inner and outer struggle that stirs up David's inner heart for more of God. And think about it. David had it all. He had power, he had position, he had the throne, he had success, he had wealth, he had riches, he had everything that men and women say we've got to have to be happy. He had it all. And he knows from personal experience that life, all of that, life without God is meaningless. And this was the secret that drove David to press in and pursue and chase after God.